Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the courtyards of ancient Tenochtitlan, where even the walls seem to hume with secrets. The moon is bright enough to cast soft silver across the stone paths, and you're barefoot, because of course you are. Soft dust clings to your heels. A humid breeze drifts past, carrying the scent of roasted maize and something faintly floral. Somewhere nearby, a flute is playing, though you're not sure if that's real or if you're already halfway dreaming. But you're here for something different tonight. Not gods, not war, not human sacrifice, which, don't worry, we're skipping entirely. You're here for something more fragile, yet somehow more dangerous. You've arrived at a world where love was passed from hand to hand on tree bark, where someone's entire soul might be reduced to a heart glyph and a crushed flower, where a single misdrawn line could mean I adore you, or I hope you fall into a swamp. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're already tucked in, post your location and what time it is where you're listening from. I love seeing where these sleepy stories end up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But before, as I promised in the previous video, I'd like to take a moment in this one to share a little about why I started creating these stories. For nearly 10 years now, I've struggled with falling asleep once I'm in bed, and even when I do manage to drift off, I rarely sleep for more than 3 or 4 hours at a time. Over the years, my body has slowly gotten used to it. There was even a phase where I felt the need to eat something every time I woke up, but thankfully, I've moved past that. If any of this sounds familiar to you, feel free to share your experience in the comments. I won't keep you any longer. Let's get into tonight's story. You're standing outside a calm household. Twilight settled over the city like a woven shawl. You duck inside a modest courtyard where a young man is crouched beside a clay lantern. His hands are ink-stained and his face is furrowed with effort, not because he's solving some priestly riddle, but because he's trying to carve a poem onto bark without smudging the metaphor for eternal gaze. This, my friend, is your introduction to Aztec romance. It's not like modern love, at least not on the surface. There's no texting, no emojis, though oddly the glyph for heartbeat skipping like a frog comes pretty close. But make no mistake, the desire to woo, to impress, to reach out across space with a tiny, trembling hope, that's eternal. And yet, you probably wouldn't survive a week in this system. First, you'd need to learn Nahuatl pictograms, some of which changed meaning based on color, direction, or even how wobbly your hand was when drawing them. Second, every note had to obey strict poetic form. You couldn't just say, "Hey, I like you." No, your letter had to mention rivers, obsidian, hummingbirds, or stars reflected in blood. Romantic, right? Historians still argue whether these letters were actually common or reserved for the elite. Some believe most love was whispered, not written. Others point to caches of bark paper fragments found buried with lovers or burned at the base of household altars as proof of widespread amorous literacy. One archaeologist even claimed that certain trash heaps in Tenochtitlan were full of love notes torn dramatically in half, which feels painfully modern. Here's the kicker. Love letters weren't always written by the sender. If your handwriting, or let's be honest, your poetry, wasn't up to snuff, you'd hire a love letter scribe. These guys, and a few women, made decent coin turning clumsy crushes into lyrical masterpieces. Like a Tinder profile ghostwriter, but with more hummingbirds and fewer shirtless photos. The setting sun throws long shadows across the stone floor as you kneel beside the young man. now watching the ink dry. His letter smells faintly of wild marigold, and he's debating whether to fold it once or twice. Each fold sends a different message. One fold means I'm shy. 2 folds, I'm serious. 3 folds, you're practically engaged. He ties the note with maguey fiber. Tomorrow it'll be passed to a courier, or maybe to the woman's cousin or best friend or flower seller neighbor, because in Aztec love, the delivery method mattered as much as the message. But that's for later. For now, the lantern flickers, the letter waits, and you feel it too, that fluttery heartbeat, moment before one person's words try to find their way into another person's world. The letter rests gently in the young man's lap, his thumb stroking the soft fibers of the bark like a talisman. It's not just paper, it's amate, a living thing that once fluttered as part of a fig tree canopy deep in the valley's damp groves. And in the Aztec world, amate was no casual canvas. This wasn't the sort of bark you grabbed to scribble a grocery list. It had weight, purpose, blessing. You watch as he presses the folded letter to his forehead, a gesture that's both thanks and protection. In Aztec belief, paper didn't just carry words, it carried breath, intention, even echoes of the gods. Especially this kind of paper. Amate was used in rituals, in offerings, even in funeral bundles. The fact that lovers chose it for their most vulnerable admissions tells you something. This isn't trivial. This is sacred flirtation. So how did they make it? The man's father, who isn't supposed to know what's going on but definitely does, once showed him the process. It begins in the hills, where fig and mulberry trees bleed long, pale strips when cut just so. Those strips are soaked in ash-laced water until they become pliable. Then they're pounded flat with obsidian stones until the bark fibers mesh into something soft but sturdy. And that's before you even add the symbolic touches. Some lovers scented the paper with marigold or cacao dust. Others whispered over it, infusing it with their voice. One tale even tells of a woman who pricked her finger and dotted the corner with a drop of blood. Not enough to be dramatic, just enough to say, "This is real." Historians still debate whether these scented love letters were widely used or reserved for those of noble lineage. Some argue the labor-intensive process of paper-making meant only elites indulged in such sentimental luxury. But new digs around smaller Aztec villages show traces of pigment and folded amet in modest homes. One fragment even had pressed petals still clinging to its surface, centuries old and still stubbornly romantic. Meanwhile, the man's little sister skips past the courtyard with a bowl of steaming tamales, pretending not to notice. But she pauses, just briefly, and glances at the letter. Her eyes flicker with amusement. She knows. And you start to understand, even though love letters were private, they existed in a world that was anything but. Courtyards were shared. News spread quickly. There were no doors in Aztec homes, only cloth screens. If you wanted privacy, you had to earn it, or perform it so subtly no one could prove anything. Still, there's beauty in it, isn't there? The shared labor of love, the crafting of both message and medium. The idea that before your words were even read, they had to be grown, gathered, soaked, and beaten into being. A dog barks in the distance. The man tucks the note into a small woven pouch and ties it with the red string. Another symbol. Red for passion. Red for hope. Red for risk. You rise, the night air heavier now with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Your bare feet scuff the smooth stones as you leave the courtyard behind. The love letter stays behind with its sender, but the echo of it hums in your chest. Somewhere, folded in bark and steeped in flowers, a confession is waiting to be read. You step into another courtyard now, this one noisier, warmer, filled with the chatter of market talk and the slow scrape of a grinding stone. A different man crouches over a mat. He's older, with a calm face and ink-stained fingers, carefully arranging a pile of unused amate sheets beside him. His hair is streaked with gray, his ears heavy with turquoise plugs. He is not writing his own letter. He is writing yours. Or rather, he's writing what your heart wishes it could say, only better. Welcome to the world of the professional love letter scribe. In a society where poetic skill was admired as much as battle prowess, these writers carved out a livelihood not with blades, but with metaphors. They weren't priests, nor were they nobles, yet they wielded a kind of quiet power. With just the right phrase, they could open a heart or end a betrothal. In Aztec terms, that's practically divine intervention. The scribe pauses to sharpen his ink brush, a reed frayed delicately at the end like the tail of a hummingbird. He dips it into a thick black paste made of soot and plant gum. Then he begins to write. He mutters softly as he goes, tasting the rhythm aloud. My thoughts crawl to you like fire ants to sugar, swift and stinging. You blink. That's not exactly subtle. But the Aztecs weren't shy with their metaphors. Love was often described through nature. Burning lakes, melting obsidian, birds mating mid-flight. The point wasn't to be literal, it was to evoke feeling so strong the reader could taste it, feel it in the soles of their feet. You weren't just saying, I miss you. You were saying, I dreamt your voice fed my bones. You know, casually. Some scholars believe this practice stemmed from the training scribes received in Kami-Kak, the schools for noble children. There they memorized epic poems and learned to align their work with celestial omens. Others argue that letter scribes were often commoners with natural talent and quick ears, men who hung around marketplaces collecting overheard lines and testing them out later for coin. The truth? Probably both. One recent dig uncovered a scribe's home with both a reed stylus and a jade pendant, suggesting access to both inkpots and elite clients. A dual life of emotion and enterprise. And make no mistake, this was a business. You could pay more for a 3-glyph line or even commission a poem cycle if you were really trying to impress. Want it scented with crushed cacao nibs or kissed with blue paint? That's extra. And if you wanted your rival's letter subtly undermined in the next market square, well, some scribes had a dark side. This man, though, seems kind. He finishes the final glyph and carefully adds a small spiral in the corner, a symbol not of longing, but of waiting. Not every letter was a confession. Some were quiet hopes. Some were polite rejections wrapped in metaphors so gentle the recipient would feel oddly flattered. One preserved letter actually reads, like the moon who touches the lake but cannot drink, I admire you from distance. That's Aztec for, it's not you, it's geography. Historians still argue whether these scribes worked independently or under the supervision of noble households. Some say powerful women employed their own favored writers, controlling the romantic narrative in their favor. Others believe that skilled scribes were neutral artists, never betraying one lover's secrets to another. The man folds the letter neatly and places it inside a small reed basket beside 2 others, one perfumed, one sealed with gum resin. He hums as he works, already sketching the next commission in his head. You don't need to see the glyphs to know what it'll be about. A moon, a heron, a promise. Behind him, a boy chases a chicken across the tiles, laughing. The scribe doesn't flinch. In a world full of clamor, he makes quiet things that tremble with power. You linger just long enough to watch the ink dry. The sun has dipped below the edge of the city now, and a subtle coolness spreads across the stone streets. You follow the scent of something sweet, something earthy, almost like cinnamon and ash, and it leads you to a shaded corner where a girl is crouched over a flat stone. She isn't drawing, she's crushing petals. Crushed petals, cacao husk, a twist of dried vanilla orchid. These aren't for a meal, they're for a letter. In the Aztec world, a love note didn't just say something, it smelled like something too. This girl is preparing a message not with words, but with perfume. She sprinkles the powder into a cloth pouch, rolls a folded sheet of amati around it, and ties it with a yellow thread. Yellow for friendship or warmth, or maybe jealousy, depending on who you ask. Aztecs believed that the body had not one but multiple souls, and scent was how one soul reached out to another. A letter that smelled of cacao might signal yearning. One scented with copal incense might hint at sacred longing. Add in the wrong flower, though, say crushed tzompantli blossom associated with funeral rites, and you've just given your crush a very confusing message. Historians still argue whether these scent rituals were widely practiced or reserved for ceremonial exchanges. Some believe the use of flower powders was heavily influenced by neighboring Mixtec customs, who were famous for flower speech, a kind of poetic, fragrant persuasion. Others suggest that only the wealthiest lovers could afford such luxuries regularly, while commoners stuck to folded glyphs and desperate glances at market stalls. Still, scent was everywhere in Aztec life. From temple offerings to hair oils to painted codices, aroma wasn't accessory, it was declaration. You sit beside the girl as she finishes folding. She glances at you sideways, her fingers stained pink with hibiscus. She doesn't say a word, just lifts the little parcel to her nose, breathes in and smiles. There's no ink on this letter, no glyphs, but the message is clear. Someone's going to open it and remember the smell of a garden they've never seen. Sometimes that's enough. A runner passes the alley. The girl stands, brush straightens her tunic, and walks to meet him. She slips the scented note into his pouch with barely a whisper exchanged. You follow them with your eyes as they vanish into the narrow street, swallowed by the shadows. Now imagine receiving that letter. You unfold the bark. The smell rises first, floral, spiced, strange. It clings to your fingers like a memory. Before you've read a single word, your body has already felt something. And that's the point. The Aztecs knew that seduction wasn't just language, it was presence, and smell was the first sense that spoke. Some preserved letters, discovered in cave burials near Lake Texcoco, still held faint traces of crushed blossoms in their folds. One even had a single insect wing pressed flat inside, a detail that has puzzled scholars for decades. Was it symbolic? An accident? Or maybe a fluttering metaphor sealed forever between lovers who thought the gods were listening. A dog whines in the distance. The girl's scent lingers in the air long after she's gone, and for a moment you wonder who taught her which flower meant what. A sister? A neighbor? Or was it instinct? Back then, everyone was fluent in symbols. Every fold, every hue, every petal had a purpose, and just like that, you feel the weight of her little perfumed note still in the air, whispering to no one and everyone at once. You find yourself now in a sun-drenched training courtyard, the kind usually reserved for warriors, except today no one is sharpening obsidian blades. Instead, a group of students, barely older than children, are hunched over bark-paper scrolls practicing their glyphs. They giggle as one boy draws a butterfly with cartoonishly big wings, and a girl beside him mockingly adds an extra foot to a journey symbol. It's here that you discover Aztec love letters were beautiful, but also dangerously easy to misread. Glyphs were the language of the elite, the priests, the educated, and, most importantly, the romantics. But unlike modern alphabets, these symbols didn't just stand for sounds. They stood for concepts, ideas, and sometimes entire phrases. A single drawing of a footprint, for instance, could mean a physical journey or the emotional act of stepping into someone's life. Add a butterfly next to it, that might suggest a fleeting love. Unless the butterfly was facing left, then it might mean a departed soul or a desire to leave. Confused yet? Historians still debate the exact nuances. Some glyphs are known from codices, others from temple murals, and many from guesswork. The truth is, interpreting a love letter in Nahuatl pictograms was a little like reading a horoscope written in riddles, which, frankly, feels very on brand for romance. You crouch beside one of the students who's trying to draw the heartfire glyph, a combination of a beating heart and 3 upward lines like incense smoke. His version looks more like a melted tomato. He sighs, crumples the paper, and starts again. Why so much pressure? Because the stakes were high. One wrong stroke could change the tone from, "I want to court you respectfully," to, "I hope your llama explodes." And yes, someone once accidentally sent a glyph that implied a wish for livestock misfortune, an error that became a family joke passed down for generations. The girl beside him whispers a question. Should I add the flower before or after the moon? It depends. If you put the flower first, it implies you're offering beauty to be judged. Moon first? You're inviting secrecy and intimacy. These were decisions that had to be felt as much as understood. There's evidence that glyphs evolved depending on social status. In noble courts, messages became increasingly intricate, personal sigils, colored inks, wax seals. But among merchants or farmers, the same concepts were boiled down to just a few trusted symbols: a heart, a hand, a path. The simplicity didn't cheapen the message, it sharpened it, like carving an entire feeling into a single line. One recovered letter, written on weathered bark and found behind a collapsed wall, contained just 2 glyphs, a flame and a teardrop. No one knows who wrote it, no one knows who received it, but you can guess what it meant. You rise as the students scatter, their scrolls tucked under arms, their glyphs wobbling with charm. The teacher, an old man with faded tattoos and a reed pen behind his ear, nods at you and mouths something in Nahuatl. You don't catch the words, but the tone is soft, almost amused. You walk on, wondering how many lovers spent entire afternoons debating whether to draw 2 suns or 1. And maybe, just maybe, you understand now why a simple love letter in the Aztec world was never truly simple. You've barely turned the corner when you hear it. The soft rustle of fabric, the quick intake of breath, the unmistakable sound of someone shoving something out of sight. You pause behind a low wall. Through a gap in the stones you see a girl, no older than 16, clutching a letter to her chest like it's a stolen jewel. She's not alone. Behind her, an older woman, mother, aunt, or maybe a household matron, appears with a raised eyebrow and folded arms. The girl tries to look casual, fails, then smiles. It's the kind of smile that says, "I absolutely didn't just hide a letter about forbidden affection under the maize basket. Welcome to the paradox of Aztec romance, public modesty, private boldness. In a society structured around family honor, class obligations, and deeply rooted gender roles, love letters were as much an act of performance as passion, especially when you lived in close quarters, no privacy, no locks, and everyone, from your siblings to your great-uncle, was willing to interpret your sighs as something. Parents weren't exactly thrilled about spontaneous romances. Courtship was ideally managed, arranged even, especially in noble families, where marriages sealed political alliances. But still, lovers found their way. They folded letters inside cloaks, tucked them beneath tortilla cloths, or handed them off to market vendors who knew how to smile and say nothing. Historians still argue whether Aztec parents disapproved of romance itself or simply the unpredictability of it. One school suggests that casual courtship was allowed, encouraged even, so long as it followed community norms. Another camp insists that any letter not sanctioned by elders risked shame or punishment, particularly for daughters. Regardless, the reality was more fluid than the law. In the surviving fragments of poetry and personal correspondence, you hear voices negotiating love through wit and metaphor, as if love was a bird you weren't allowed to own, but could occasionally feed. You peek again. The older woman has softened. She nudges the girl toward the garden path, muttering something about finishing her chores before moonrise. But as they go, you catch a flicker of a grin, the shared understanding between generations. Maybe she once folded a letter with jasmine petals too. Not every intercepted letter caused scandal. Some sparked entire family debates. One recovered glyph note from the outskirts of Texcoco includes 2 margin symbols clearly added by someone other than the original author, possibly a sibling helping edit, or teasing, or both. And then there were the ones meant to be found. You walk past a mural painted with stylized hearts and rivers, symbols of fertility and growth, and notice a folded bit of bark tucked into a crack in the wall, hidden in plain sight. It's unsigned, but it smells faintly of crushed sage and has a glyph for open drawn right on the outside. Not subtle. Aztec lovers often crafted messages not only for each other but for the eyes that might accidentally discover them. A sort of pre-modern plausible deniability. Oh, that poem about longing in a moonlit orchard, that was just practice. Right. This entire world is a dance between expression and concealment, between daring and decorum, between what you want to say and what you can say, and what you hope someone will say for you when your mother's in the room. You continue walking, the air thicker now with the sound of evening drums in the distance. Somewhere someone is lighting a cooking fire. Somewhere else, a young girl is rereading her note and deciding whether it's too soon to write back. And somewhere, maybe near you, a pair of parents are pretending not to notice the faint perfume of marigold coming from their daughter's cloak. The sun has fully set now, and you find yourself trailing a figure through the quiet city streets. He's quick, silent, and completely barefoot. A runner, not just any runner, a Peinani, one of the fast-footed messengers who carry more than news and tributes. Tonight, this one carries love. Strapped to his chest is a small pouch. Inside it, a folded sheet of amate, warm from its sender's hands and faintly perfumed with crushed cacao flowers. The runner doesn't know what it says, doesn't care. His job isn't to read, his job is to deliver, and not get eaten by a jaguar. This is Tenochtitlan after all. There are canals to cross, markets to avoid, watchful neighbors to dodge. Delivering a love letter in the Aztec Empire required speed, stealth, and, frankly, a decent amount of nerve. Historians still debate how these private messages moved through such a public society. Some say letters were mostly passed within neighborhoods, slipped discreetly by cousins, flower girls, or the ever-undiscovered tamale vendors. Others insist the formal courier system, usually reserved for official imperial business, was sometimes quietly repurposed for more personal missions, especially by those with noble connections or well-placed bribes. Tonight, our runner is not on imperial business. He's delivering a message from a musician's daughter to the son of a feather merchant. Not scandalous exactly, but not ideal either. Their families trade insults more often than goods. A letter could smooth things over, or make everything worse. The runner skids to a stop behind a reed fence and waits. A parrot calls once from a nearby rooftop. That's the signal. A door creaks, a shadow steps out. It's him, the boy. Hair still damp from washing, hands nervously wiping on his tunic. The runner gives a curt nod and hands over the letter, then vanishes before a single word is said, like wind or gossip. You watch as the boy opens the folded bark carefully, then leans in and sniffs. His smile grows slowly. The scent has done its job, and now the words will take over. But not all letters arrive as intended. In some regions, especially those bordering rival city-states, runners were known to be intercepted, either by rivals, jealous suitors, or nosy elders. One infamous tale speaks of a letter that traveled 4 days on foot only to be torn up and burned by the recipient's father, who then married his daughter off to a priest. The couple later reunited through coded market songs. Very dramatic, very illegal. To prevent mishaps, clever senders developed tricks, sealing letters in gourds, hiding them inside loaves of bread, even using decoy messages filled with deliberately bland poetry in case of interception. One preserved note included the line, "This message is about maize yields. Absolutely nothing romantic here." Spoiler, it was very romantic. Some even trained trusted animals to assist. A tame quail, it's rumored, once delivered a letter tied to its leg across 3 temple courtyards. Historians disagree on whether this actually happened, or if it's just the ancient version of a viral story. Either way, it's delightful. Tonight, though, the boy tucks the letter inside a small pouch at his belt, glancing once more at the moonlit street where the runner disappeared. The city is quiet again, just the chirp of insects and the faint lap of canal water nearby. And you're beginning to see that love in the Aztec world wasn't whispered, it was moved, carried, protected like a treasure, or chased like a rumor. You step back from the scene, your path lit only by the flickering torches set along the walkways. And somewhere out there, another runner waits. Another letter needs delivering. Another night begins. You wake early. The sky hasn't lightened yet, but the city is already stirring. Soft clatter of cooking pots, the distant splash of a water jug being filled, and above it all, faint murmurs of gossip. You follow the sound through a market quarter just beginning to come alive. Cornflowers are being arranged, tomatillos weighed, and just behind the tamal stall, 2 women are talking in low voices, glancing from time to time at a folded letter tied with blue thread. By thread? Blue for longing, for dreams, for things that cannot be spoken aloud. You've stepped now into the delicate world of forbidden affection, not dramatic Romeo and Juliet levels of tragedy, though the Aztecs had their share of those too, but the quieter, more common kind. Love between classes, between clans, across expectations. These weren't always outlawed, but they were inconvenient, complicated, dangerous to pursue openly. So the letters had to evolve. In this world, a glyph wasn't just a glyph. It was a layer. One symbol could carry multiple meanings depending on who read it. A footprint might mean walk to me, but also I walked away. A drawn house might be home, or it might be the place they're forbidden to enter. The butterfly, freedom, or fragility, or rebirth. And if you were clever, you'd encode your meaning with combinations. A flame inside a flower could say, I burn for you, but I must remain still. A lake beside a tree might suggest waiting. Add a hummingbird, and it becomes a plea. Add rain, regret. Historians still argue how many layers of interpretation these glyphs had, and whether some were invented solely for romantic use. One school of thought believes entire micro-dialects of glyph poetry existed in certain districts, passed down in friend groups or inherited from grandmothers. Another theory suggests some lovers copied from temple murals and invented their own meanings, never shared with anyone else, which would explain why some recovered letters make absolutely no sense, except to the people who wrote them. In one recovered scroll, found beneath the ruins of a collapsed merchant home, the symbols are layered so intricately it's been called the Codex of Longing. Among its drawings, a serpent curled around a flower, a pair of hands with eyes in the palms, a single unlit torch. No one knows what it means, but it meant something to someone. You watch the two women now. One unties the letter with care, unfolding the bark in silence. Her eyes scan quickly, then pause. She presses a hand to her mouth. Not in shock, in recognition. She tucks the letter into her sash without saying a word. They walk away, leaving behind the scent of roasted masa and crushed marigold, and you can't help but feel like you just witnessed something intimate and ancient and still alive. Even today, there are Nahuatl-speaking communities that preserve some of this poetic encoding. In parts of central Mexico, flower metaphors still turn up in wedding blessings, in lullabies, even in political protests. The line between poetry and power remains as thin and fragrant as ever. You pass a small shrine on your way back where someone has left offerings of blue feathers and dried petals. Nearby, a note hangs from a reed stake. No glyphs, just a single folded leaf with a pressed butterfly sealed inside. It flutters slightly in the breeze and says everything. The street you walk now glows gold with morning light, and ahead is a shaded portico where a few elders sit in woven reed chairs, nodding quietly at the day. But don't let the stillness fool you. This is a place where words carry weight, because here, in the shade of nobility, poetry can be a blade. You're about to learn that in the Aztec world, love letters weren't just instruments of longing. They were weapons, tools of negotiation, sometimes even social traps. Inside the hall beyond the portico, a young noble kneels, carefully composing a letter with the help of two advisors, not priests, not warriors, but older cousins, men who've survived their own heartbreaks, affairs, and in one case a very public betrothal disaster involving a misread glyph for fertility. They lean over his shoulder, debating how best to phrase what is essentially, I want to court your daughter and also elevate my family's standing by association. Romantic, no. The line he ends up writing is this: "Your daughter's voice echoes in the chambers of my chest." Sounds dreamy, until you realize that chambers implies political position and echoes can suggest agreement or manipulation. Aztec elites didn't always write love letters to woo. Sometimes they wrote them to win. A carefully worded note could open a marriage negotiation or secure an alliance or offend someone just enough to start a very polite feud. Historians still argue whether this style of strategic romance was a formalized custom or simply a side effect of noble etiquette. Some evidence, like the Codex Mendoza, shows arranged marriages with strong ritual elements, but letters? They're rarely mentioned explicitly. That hasn't stopped researchers from poring over preserved glyphs and trying to decode the emotional chess beneath the flowery metaphors. One notorious example: a letter from a minor noblewoman to a rising general that used alternating fire and water symbols. Was it love? A challenge? A veiled insult? Scholars can't agree. One called it a seductive declaration. Another called it a hex. Frankly, both seem plausible. Back in the hall, the young man adds the final line: "To you I offer my breath, wrapped in jade, if you will breathe it back." A bit dramatic, but drama was kind of the point. Aztec culture prized eloquence. In the Comicac schools, boys were trained in flore canto, flower and song, the art of elegant expression, but girls were too, often in the homes of noble women, who passed on metaphors the way others passed on embroidery patterns. This meant that when it came time to write, both sides could sling symbolism with equal grace. Or venom. You leave the hall as the letter is sealed with a string soaked in blue pigment, denoting honor and clarity. Of course, it's also the color of sacrificial knives. Again, metaphors are doing a lot of work here. Outside, you overhear a merchant whispering about a recent scandal. Apparently, a letter was sent with a deliberately confusing glyph, and now two cousins are both convinced they are being courted by the same noblewoman. It's probably not true. But that doesn't matter. In this world, the idea of a love letter can cause just as much stir as the letter itself. One historian called these messages emotional landmines wrapped in silk. But you prefer to think of them as mirrors. They reflected back what each reader feared, hoped, or assumed. And sometimes, that was the real message all along. You walk on, past a line of children practicing their glyphs on clay tiles. One draws a heart, and another draws a jaguar beside it. You don't ask what it means, you already know. Now the city air is thick and sweet, the way it gets after midday, when the sun has baked the stone long enough to release every trapped scent, chilly smoke, sun-warmed feathers, and a little something musky you can't quite place. You're walking beside a quiet garden wall, the kind where lovers used to meet, under the guise of admiring the maize blossoms. But this story isn't about secret meetings. This one's about what happened when letters didn't work. You round a corner and find a boy sitting alone beside a small cracked altar stone. In front of him, a half-burned letter. The edges are curled, the glyphs are half gone, but the look on his face says the message is still perfectly clear. In the Aztec world, rejection was a ritual of its own. Love letters that weren't returned weren't simply crumpled or forgotten. They were processed, burned, buried, washed downstream. One famous tradition involved placing a rejected letter beside a bowl of salt and leaving it outside the home for a full night. If it was gone in the morning, the sender was free to try again. If it was still there, that was the gods' way of saying, "Let it go, sweetie." Some even claimed that biting the corner of a letter was a formal sign of refusal, literally tasting the bitterness of what would never be. Historians still debate whether that particular ritual was widespread or just one city's flair for dramatic flair. But enough bite-marked bark fragments have shown up in digs to suggest someone, somewhere, made it a thing. You watch as the boy adds a pinch of dried sage to the flame. He's not angry, just resigned. It's a quiet thing, mourning a message, especially when the sender never hears the reply. Sometimes letters were intercepted. Other times, the recipient responded indirectly through a family member or by simply showing up at the temple with a new suitor. One recovered letter fragment includes a tiny footnote written sideways along the edge. If your cousin reads this before you do, tell her it was meant kindly. And then there were the ones meant to disappear entirely. Among the nobility, destroying a letter could be an act of defiance, especially if it came from someone who outranked you. A subtle glyph for ash drawn on your house gate the next morning, that was enough to start whispers for weeks. Still, not all rejections were harsh. One old woman tells you, quietly while watering her marigolds, that she once sent back a letter folded with a single pressed fern. No words, no glyphs, just the fern. And he understood. She still sees him sometimes, buying beans from her cousin. They nod. That's it. There's something graceful about that, isn't there? The boy stands and gently scatters the ashes of his letter beneath a bush where hummingbirds flit. He doesn't look up, just walks away, and for a moment, the city exhales with him. You follow a quiet canal path now, where the water laps softly against the stone. A folded bit of bark floats past. Maybe another letter let go. Maybe just someone else learning the art of goodbye. Because in this world, even endings were written in poetry. The canal curves ahead like a silk ribbon laid across stone, and your footsteps slow as the city begins to thin. The houses are farther apart now, the air quieter, heavy with the scent of damp earth and freshwater lilies. You're heading beyond Tenochtitlan, beyond the towering temples and the market clangor, to places where the glyphs twist in different directions and the letters hum with a different rhythm. Welcome to the outer lands of the empire, places like Otomi country, Mixtec strongholds and lakeside villages where love letters weren't just composed, they were sung. You arrive just as a young woman steps out of her family's home with a folded scroll tucked under her sash. She's dressed differently, more layered wool than feathered finery, and her braid is wrapped in thin copper wire. She doesn't write her message, she chants it, low and soft like a prayer, and then hands the scroll to a messenger with the same casual grace someone might use to pass a fig. In these outer communities, the symbols of love were as complex as they were local. Some used the central Nahuatl glyphs of the capital, others mixed them with regional signs, Mixtec codices, Otomi logographs, even older pictograms borrowed from ancestral cave art. To an outsider, they'd look chaotic, but to someone raised in that place, it's as clear as moonlight on water. Historians still argue whether these regional styles were considered inferior or simply different. Aztec records often portray the provinces as culturally distinct, sometimes even quaint, but archaeological evidence tells a richer story, especially when it comes to romantic communication. In one lakeside village near Chauco, a stone box was found, sealed with wax, and buried beneath a household altar. Inside, 8 folded letters, each from a different sender, all addressed to the same girl. The glyphs were stitched with thread into bark paper, not written, no ink, just color, fiber, and perfume. You cross paths with a traveling musician now, carrying a hollowed gourd drum and humming a slow circular tune. He tells you, without breaking his stride, that some lovers send songs instead of letters. The lyrics are coded, the melody laced with metaphors that only two people might understand. A particular bird call at the chorus, a sign, a borrowed verse from a marriage festival chant, a proposal. Among the Mixtec, entire love stories were preserved in painted books. You wouldn't just read your grandmother's love letter. You'd open a leather-bound codex and see her drawn beside a waterfall, her glyph tied to the shadow of a tree, her lover sketched beside her, offering maize. Visual, emotional. Even the materials varied. Instead of amat, some used deerskin, cotton cloth, even pressed leaves coated in beeswax. The goal was always the same: convey feeling. But the means were endlessly inventive. You pause near a field where farmers are lighting incense near small shrined stones. One offers a folded paper tied with a braid of corn husk. It's not addressed to a person, but to a spirit, a letter of longing sent into the wind. So, yes, love letters existed beyond the empire's heart, and sometimes they were even bolder. Outside the capital's scrutiny, lovers could write more plainly, more personally. One preserved note from a woman in an Otomi village reads, "If you come, I will feed you what I would feed the gods, direct, fierce, hungry." You sit beneath a tree for a moment and think about how far these feelings have traveled, how people with different tongues, clothes, and stars above them still wrote to say the same thing: "Come back, think of me, I ache for you." And you realize the further you go from the city, the closer you get to the raw heartbeat of the human voice. The sky has turned a deep, honeyed gold by the time you return to the city's edge, where the air thickens again with smoke, voices, and the distant thrum of drums. But your path leads you not toward the temples or the markets, but to a quieter courtyard lined with whitewashed stone. This is the women's quarter, and here the love letters take on another tone entirely. You arrive just as a group of women gather under a wooden awning, folding cloth and crushing pigments. Their chatter is light, until one of them pulls out a folded piece of amet, delicately inked and sealed with a loop of red string. The others lean closer. One raises an eyebrow, another suppresses a smirk. Because in this circle, everyone reads between the lines. In Aztec society, women were both respected and restricted. They could inherit property, run markets, and become priestesses. But when it came to romance, their voices were often expected to be soft, indirect, symbolic. And yet, behind closed doors, in sisterhoods and among friends, the letters they wrote pulsed with wit, fire, and sometimes flat-out rebellion. The letter being passed around now is one such flame. The ink is fine, but the glyphs, oh, they're bold. A moon crossed with a cornflower, a serpent coiled in a basket, and, just beneath the fold, a tiny hummingbird striking a cactus. Code for defiance, for desire that refuses to wilt. Historians still argue how often Aztec women initiated correspondence. Some say it was rare and risky, that most love letters were composed on behalf of women, not by them. But others point to bundles of letters found hidden in women's storage jars and cooking spaces. One letter even bore a glyph for the author's name, a woman's name, drawn proudly in the corner. Here in this courtyard, though, the debate is long settled. These women don't just write. They edit. They advise. One young woman is hunched over her letter now, and 3 others are huddled behind her, offering suggestions like spiritual copy editors. No, no, don't use the water glyph after the jaguar. It sounds desperate. Switch the flower to a thorn one, it's funnier. And then there are the subversion. Some women wrote letters using masculine-coded glyphs to assume authority. Others flipped known romantic metaphors, using a symbol of a broken basket not to mourn lost love, but to declare independence from it. There are even records, scarce but unmistakable, of women writing to other women, their messages cloaked in flower metaphors, too intricate for most readers to decode. You sit quietly among them as another letter is folded, scented, and tucked into the hem of a cloak. It's going to the bathhouse, where someone waits. Not for a grand declaration, just a reply, just an echo. And you notice something. While men's letters often reach for the stars, talk of gods, omens, empire, these letters are different, closer, bodied, rooted in kitchens, rivers, moonlight on clay floors. They carry the hum of everyday life, made electric with a glance, a gesture, a petal slipped inside a fold. One letter, passed between 2 women near the edge of the courtyard, is made of coarse paper and contains only one glyph. A spider web. In this context, not entrapment. Connection. Before you leave, one of them smiles and offers you a folded scrap. It's blank. No ink, no scent, just the paper. The message is clear enough. You don't always need words to be understood. You step into the street again, a heartbeat quiet, wondering how many love stories lived and died without ever being spoken aloud, and how many still lived, folded quietly between fingers, beneath sleeves, on the lips of those who dared. The sun has slipped behind the temples now, casting long lavender shadows across the causeways. You're walking toward the ceremonial district, where the city feels taller, heavier, like the air itself has rules. It's here, in the shadow of the palace, that the most powerful love letters were written, and the most dangerous. Because tonight, you're stepping into the world of emperors. A servant rushes past, carrying a bundle of scrolls tied with silk threads, not tribute documents, not war orders, letters, royal ones, most likely sealed with a jade clasp and perfumed with crushed copal. Messages from the Tlatoani himself, the ruler of Tenochtitlan, whose words shape the heavens and whose sigh might just reshape a marriage alliance. In Aztec high society, love letters weren't simply about emotion. They were about control. A well-phrased note could mean a new alliance. A veiled line of verse could signal favoritism or the removal of favor. And yes, some emperors used letters to charm. Others, to manipulate. You approach a quiet room tucked behind the palace complex. Inside, a scribe is bent over a sheet of bark paper so thin it's nearly translucent. The words he inks aren't his own. He's writing for the Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker, a man who ruled over millions, yet still felt the need to tell one woman her laughter reminded him of rain on volcanic stone. Historians still argue whether these letters were personally dictated or crafted by proxy. Some believe rulers like Moctezuma II composed their own poetic overtures, citing records of his education in Kalmykiak and his talent for formal speech. Others argue that teams of scribes, guided by noble women or spiritual advisors, constructed messages that served political aims wrapped in romance. A recovered royal letter from an archive in Tlatelolco reads, "To you, flower of the east wind, I send this breath that shaped my name. It's been interpreted as both courtship and command, and it worked. The woman later joined the palace household, though whether as consort or hostage remains unclear. You walk past the room and into a gallery lined with painted codices. On one, a scene unfolds, a noble woman reading a scroll, her face serene, her hair bound in turquoise threads. Around her, glyphs spiral like smoke, each one a symbol of attention, obligation, desire. This isn't seduction, it's a strategy. And yet, even here, some letters were genuine. You hear a whispered story from an elderly steward about a letter the emperor once sent with no title, no seal, just a folded strip of plain paper slipped into a sandal left near a temple. The glyphs were simple, a maize kernel and a flame. The reply came 3 days later, folded into a piece of embroidered cloth with a single drop of honey. No names were ever spoken, but every servant knew, and they never spoke of it aloud again. Even the gods were not immune to this correspondence. Some emperors sent offerings in the form of poetic messages to the divine. These ritual love letters were burned on altars, the smoke believed to carry the words upward. One temple altar still bears the traces of over 200 folded papers, each smeared with crushed flowers and painted in symmetrical verses. Love, in this case, not for another person, but for balance, for blessing, for beauty itself. You sit now on the edge of a stone bench, listening to the echo of footsteps in the great hall. Somewhere above you, a servant ties a red string around a scroll meant for a noblewoman in Texcoco, and down the hall, a young girl holds a sealed note to her lips, waiting for her name to be spoken in return. Because even at the top, especially at the top, love letters were never just about love. They were about saying everything without saying too much, and they could bring comfort, or ruin, or both. The city has gone quiet in that peculiar way just before true nightfall, when even the birds seem to pause and the air settles into a slow, suspended hush. You follow that hush to a small workshop perched beside a canal, its walls lined with faded scrolls and bits of bark paper tucked into clay jars. Inside, a man sits cross-legged, gently restoring an old letter by lamplight. The edges are brittle, but his fingers are patient. This isn't a museum. It's more like a shrine or a memory. He's part of a small guild that still reads the old glyphs, not for translation, but for echo. They believe these letters aren't just artifacts, they're voices, and some of them, if read carefully, still speak back. Tonight, he's working on a letter written 3 centuries ago, preserved between 2 slabs of cedar wood. It smells faintly of crushed cornflour. The ink is dark red, likely iron pigment or ground cochineal beetle, used when one wanted the words to endure. The letter is addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone. The first glyph, a mirrored path. The second, a cracked bell. The third, a heart crossed with what looks like a palm frond. He reads aloud in a whisper, eyes closed, letting the rhythm guide him. Historians still argue whether many of these letters were ever meant to be read at all. Some may have been rituals, others confessions. Some were buried beneath houseposts, folded into burial robes, or left inside shrines built for dreams. And yet, some letters, some Seths, still find their way to readers. A preserved scroll found near Xochimilco contains a story in glyphs, a long, looping sequence about 2 lovers separated by floodwaters. Each glyph is drawn like a beat in a song. Boat, torch, moon, tears, flame, bridge. No names, just feelings. Some researchers say it's the earliest romantic narrative in the region. Others say it's just a prayer. Either way, the way the brush strokes arc carefully, emotionally, someone cried while writing it. The man at the desk tells you of a recent find. A sealed clay jar opened after a mudslide. Inside, 11 letters, perfectly preserved, still fragrant. The contents? Arguments, pleas, apologies, and one that ended with a single glyph, a bird flying away, with no return path marked. You think about how we store things, in boxes, in drawers, in the corners of memory we pretend we've dusted. The Aztecs stored theirs in symbols that refuse to vanish. Some modern Nahua poets still write in that tradition. Layered metaphor, scent, glyph. One woman, whose grandmother preserved old bark fragments in a tin bread box, composes poems using the same symbols today. Her lines get published. Sometimes they're read aloud at weddings. And yes, sometimes they're folded and passed, hand, because love letters never really go extinct. They adapt, they wait. You step back from the desk as the man carefully folds the restored scroll and ties it with a thread of maguey fiber. It's going into a pouch, not for safekeeping, but for sharing. Someone else will read it next week, and someone after that. Each of them adding a whisper, an interpretation, an ache. You look at the shelf, hundreds of notes, unnamed, unclaimed, but not unloved. And suddenly you wonder how many people, back then, now, have written something not to be answered, but to be felt. Glyphs that say, "Here is what I couldn't tell you out loud." Now it's night. Not evening, not dusk. Night. The city lies in its quietest form, the torches guttering low, the canals still as black obsidian. Even the dogs have stopped barking. You walk the causeway slowly, your footsteps soundless, your thoughts full of paper and flowers and flame. One last stop. You turn down a side path lined with sleeping homes toward the edge of the sacred precinct where the city surrenders itself to stars. There, at the base of a small household shrine, a family altar older than any scroll, you see it. A letter. It's wrapped in dyed cotton, tied with a thin string, and placed just so beside an obsidian mirror. The mirror glints faintly in the starlight, its surface dark, endless. Beside it, a bowl of water, a single marigold, a name etched into bark, not meant to be spoken aloud. You sit. This is not a letter for the living. This is a goodbye. In Aztec tradition, the dead didn't disappear. They simply walked farther. To send them a message, one didn't cry into the night or burn incense alone. One wrote, folded the pain into metaphor, offered it up with the same care as a love note. Sometimes it was a confession, sometimes an apology, sometimes just a whisper. You were known. Historians still debate the ritual significance of these offerings. Some believe they were letters to ancestors meant to be burned or buried during the Mikelhutantli festivals. Others insist they were private gestures, silent ways to grieve, to remember, to continue conversations no one else could hear. In either case, the act of writing was not about answers, it was about release. You lean forward, examining the letter. The glyphs are simple. A bird, a bone, a heart. Then, near the edge, a water drop falling into a flame. You're not sure what it means. You're not supposed to. Some meanings are meant only for two people. One here, one not. You feel the stillness around you stretch. There is no rush, no noise, just the steady exhale of time, the kind of silence that doesn't press, but holds. A breeze stirs, the marigold petals tremble, the mirror glimmers, and suddenly you remember, even the dead once sent love letters, maybe still do. And now, slowly, softly, we wind down. Your breath slows with the air, the stone beneath you cools, the water in the bowl glints and rests. You are far from the marketplace, far from the couriers, far from the poets and the hidden garden walls. You are here, in the gentle hum between what was said and what was only felt. Let the images fade now, folded paper, crushed flowers, ink that still remembers the shape of a name. Let them drift like leaves on a canal, going where they must, not asking for reply. And if you have someone in mind, someone you never wrote to, perhaps tonight you will, even if it's only in thought, even if it's only in a dream. Good night, traveler of words. You made it to the end, and so did they.